generative AI at a top level with a human rights lens, highlighting some of the opportunities or risks as well as common misperceptions. So now I'm going to hand this off to Michael Kleinman, Director of the Silicon Valley Initiative at Amnesty International.
Thanks so much, and thank you so much to everyone who's joining. First, an apology that unable to enable chat, but if anyone has any questions, please just put them in the Q&A and we will definitely flag them. I don't have too much to add to what Leah said, and I will keep my remarks very, very short. As we at Amnesty and I personally have started to think more and more about generative AI, one of the main questions that I've really been wrestling with and that I'm really looking forward to hearing the panelists talk about, as well as just through the Q&A, is to what extent is this different? We have a lot of experience applying categories of harms around privacy or harassment to existing technologies. Bias is another, discrimination, copyright, as Leah said. And it's certainly possible to map those onto generative AI, and that's something that we need to be acutely aware of. One of the, if not the main question that I think remains unanswered is, in addition to these harms, both what are new kinds of harms that this kind of technology might present, and at the same time, what are new opportunities for civil society groups, for activists, and for others? So with that, I would love to introduce our three panelists, and a huge thank you to the panelists for agreeing to join us today. The first is JD Zamfirescu. He is a PhD student at UC Berkeley researching large language models. He uses he, him pronouns, and he's going to talk about some of the background around decoupling text from human authors and related problems, and some of the implications for activism and policy. Next, we'll hear from Shirin Anlen, a media technologist from Witness who uses she, her pronouns, and she will talk about trust, access, transparency, and consent in the context of generative AI. And finally, we'll hear from Ken Mickles, the Chief Technology Officer for Fight for the Future. He uses he, him pronouns, and his topic will be privacy, an intro to generative AI for human rights activists. And to our panelists, if I got any of your names wrong, if I mispronounced them, if I made any mistakes, please, please, please correct me. And with that, I will hand it over to JD.
Thanks, Michael. It's a pleasure to be here. My name is JD Zamfirescu. As Michael said, I'm a PhD student at Berkeley, and I study one class of generative AI called large language models. These are basically generative models for text, although they have grown to include sort of images and image input as well. I wanted to give a little bit of background for folks who aren't quite sure. I thought it'd be helpful to just talk a little bit about the history of where this came from. The idea of a language model is something that linguists have looked at for decades. It is basically a way to create aggregate statistics over the pairs of words in language, for example, or which concepts are likely to appear next to each other. Large language models are basically the sort of crazy extreme version of this, where they take up a huge amount of resources, memory, computing power, etc., but they are much more effective at prediction. And they tend to be trained in two ways. So the first is that they're trained essentially as parrots. So this is like a machine learning algorithm that is fed all of the internet, essentially all of Wikipedia and Reddit and, whatever proprietary information Google and Facebook might have. It could be conversations between people, etc. All of this is fed into a system whose one job is to predict the next word that might come after all the previous words that it's seen. So you could imagine a recipe being trained on a recipe. It's gone through all the way through step 4, and it's being asked to predict, what is step 5 of the recipe? And then being sort of trained and machine learned into being more likely to actually say the right step 5 the next time it is asked. So that's sort of the parrot piece. And then there's this other piece that they're also being trained. They're being steered by what's called human feedback. If you've heard RLHF, reinforcement learning with human feedback, they're essentially given a second step of, here are the kinds of things these models are saying. Let's ask people what they think. Do they like these outputs or not? And then that feedback is being incorporated into future training rounds. And this improves a lot the sort of interactivity of these systems. It improves their sort of ability to follow instruction and things like that. It's important to note that because of the way these things are trained, like one thing that's not part of that training regime is like what is true or correct. Another part of that training regime is a whole bunch of internet text, which has very little to do with what is true or correct, right? To say nothing of unbiased or ethical or anything like that. And so you end up in these situations where you're looking at a lot, where you get a lot of outputs from these systems that are totally reflective of many of the horrible things that happen on the internet, because there's not really any filtering on that kind of thing. And you also get a lot of things that are merely plausible rather than true. And if you've ever interacted with like a small child who's like trying to make an argument with you about something, they might, they want pancakes and they're like, hey, I want pancakes. And you're like, well, I don't know, we're going to make pancakes today. And the kid says, well, but today is Tuesday and we always make pancakes on Tuesday. And it's like, not actually Tuesday. And we don't actually make pancakes on Tuesday, but it just sounds like the kind of thing that you would say in an argument. And you get a lot of that kind of hallucinatory, plausible text that sounds like a human might say it, but actually has no grounding, has no bearing with reality whatsoever. And that's where some of the human feedback comes in. All right, hopefully that was some helpful background there. I'll also make a few notes here. I think it's a mistake to think of these things as being sort of humans or agents. They don't really have, at least the way they're trained so far, any kinds of goals beyond what I just described, like predicting the next word. They don't really make decisions in any real sense. They just are making predictions based on the data that you've already got. And I think one way to think about them differently is more as like a cultural technology, as sort of a repository of all of this internet text that they've been trained on, all of this human feedback that they've received. And sort of you're essentially poking at this giant predictive machine rather than like a person that has goals and that wants something. All right, so having said that, I think that these systems primarily differ from the previous AI models that had concerns for human rights in a couple fundamental ways. I think one of the ways is simply the scale and the accessibility of these kinds of systems. One of the areas that I'm especially concerned about is surveillance. So up until now, there have been a lot of concerns around who's like watching all of our telecommunications and what are they doing with that information. And I think in the US, we have a lot of laws and a lot of policies and a lot of agencies, and there's just a lot of questions around what exactly is happening. In other parts of the world, and this is not my area of expertise, so I apologize in advance if I say anything that's off here, but in other parts of the world, there's a little looser. And I think governments in many cases act with a little bit more impunity around looking at the data coming in and have access to a lot more of that underlying data. And one of the things that large language models, sort of these things that can look at text and make predictions based on that text, is that they can suddenly have this arsenal of systems that can look at text and try to identify intent in that text, can try to identify more than just keywords, which was relatively straightforward to do before, but also sort of hidden phrases and hidden meaning and conversations that shift over time to sort of try to expose, try to get around like censorship and things like that. I think these systems are going to become adaptive way more quickly to that kind of shifting. And I think that's kind of a real concern. I think also there's this sort of assumption, this is the decoupling that Michael mentioned, decoupling of text from human authors, a sort of assumption that when you read text, someone wrote it, and that's going away. And when we use text as a proxy for things like competence or ability or meaning or some kind of thinking going through or an experience that a human has had, to the extent that those are already kind of tenuous, I think they're about to disappear entirely there. So maybe I'll leave it there. Happy to chat about any of this and answer questions later.
JD, thanks so much. And Shirin, turning it over to you.
Thanks, Michael, and thanks, JD. It was a really interesting introduction and background. So I'm Shirin Anlen. I'm from Witness. I'm doing the Technologist in the Technology Threats and Opportunity Program, which kind of look at the same topics we are talking today, what is the concern, what is the hopes of new technology. Witness is a human rights organization. We are global, and our mission is to how we can use videos and emerging technology in order to defend and protect human rights. So I'll probably in my point will look more into the audiovisual generative AI. And since 2018, Witness has been leading an initiative called Prepare Don't Panic, where we don't want to panic about what's coming, but to prepare for it. But we are reaching this tipping point when we are, okay, we prepared enough what we are doing right now. So I think that's this conversation is exciting, and I'm happy to be here in that point. I think like Michael presented, my 3 points around trust, access and transparency, and consent. And with trust, I think like we all saw what happened this week with like Trump images of his potential arrest that is coming, and how it circulated online and all the attention it's received. And kind of like going back to your question, Michael, like to what extent is this different right now? It's the volume and the scale that it's easy to create, right? And how it's easy to undermine the public trust, and how it's like it's so much easy if you have like a malicious intent to kind of like create and spread disinformation. But disinformation is not the new topic, it's the scale and the volume of it. And I keep hearing in the last couple of days or weeks the same question coming up from journalists and fact checkers. So what can I do? Like, how can I tell what is fake and what is real? And this kind of question is really worrying, because we are starting to just not believing what we see, but at the same time, we cannot unsee what we see. So there is this kind of like effect of what can I trust, and when I don't trust and I cannot unsee what I see, there is this like psychology social effect that is being developed there. And for Witness side, like audiovisual content is super important. We are coming from evidence, so how we can protect evidence. Evidence is a super relevant field, and been leading the field of like protecting human rights and showing proof for what's happening in the ground. But if we cannot believe it, and it's so easy to undermine, it's so easy to recreate events that still didn't happen, we are entering this like kind of worrying moment around that. Yeah, and I think that's like kind of like leading me to like the next topics around access and transparency, when like the burden to prove what is fake is one thing, but the burden to prove what is real is a whole different challenge. And usually it's the burden on the human rights defenders, on journalists, on fact checkers. So how can we not do that this time, right? Every time we are entering this like new technology phase, we are in this new phase of like, okay, let's do this time. Let's do better this time. Let's learn from our mistakes and develop better technology infrastructure, kind of like the conversation last year with Web3, right? But so like how we can actually like support, in addition to policy and regulation that are important but pretty slow, how we can support like the development of social ethical norms that goes along with the development of technology. And that goes like for 2 points of like, one is the disclosure norms. So how disclosure can be part and should be part for any point of the technology development, from any level of production, from the dataset collection to the training to the quality control that companies are doing or declaring they're doing this like private testing, user testing, but they are not open. We don't know who been involved, how globally diverse was it, who actually had access to view the data and understand the limitation of it. And it will be great that it will be open, but also that it will include those like kind of like a machine readable fingerprint or human readable provenance trail, kind of like the C2PA, the Content Initiative, Authenticity Initiative is doing. And I would like to refer, I will put in the chat after I'll finish, a link to the partnership on AI framework that was just released. And they look at those like 3 actors, right? There is 3 actors that should be responsible and accountable to the development. One is the maker of the tool, the developers, makers. The second is the creators themselves, and the third is the distribution platforms. And all of them needs to take responsibility in how we are marking generative. And that should also allow us, because we didn't have that with shallow fakes, allow us to have access to detection tools and detection skills, things. Since like part of our working witness, we are doing global convenience. We are going to, currently my team is in Nairobi, and we keep hearing over and over again, we need access to detection tools. We need to understand how we can read those materials and understand how to separate. And when we are entering this like generative AI landscape, detection become much more complex if you're not embedding the fingerprint in advance. And then thinking about like more how it's also when we have detection tools in the fingerprint, how it can support sustainable AI media literacy. And part of our work is like when we are also going back to who is responsible. So creators are also part of the responsible, and the Trump images that were circulated, it will be great if they will be marked in advance that they are generative, use generative AI tools. Part of what we are looking at is also how we can like use labeling as a creative act. It doesn't need to be just a burden that you add to your work. It doesn't need to be just a warning sign. It can be also an opportunity to disclose more information of what you used, how it's been used, more transparency on the process itself to push us as audience to understand how the media is being created. And Witness is doing a lot of work on that side too, and I will link some reference for that in the chat too. But again, there is a huge opportunity. It's not just threat towards threat. There is a lot of opportunity for expressive and creative potential, and creative potential for human rights as well. And we have to get involved in the tool in order to understand them, and like also see who is being involved, who voices are being involved in shaping those creative potential and bringing forward. And my last point is when we are thinking about those global issues that are not on the table right now and how we can bring them more forward, we also need to think about consent. So misinformation is a huge problem, but there is also like one of the most the biggest threat we see currently in synthetic media is a gender-based abuse imagery, non-consensual sexual imagery. And we have to develop with the disclosure, with the labeling mechanism, also opt-in, opt-out mechanism from the data set themselves. That will be my last point. Thank you so much. Yeah, I'll continue with questions.
Shirin, thank you so much. And Ken, over to you to take us home. And then and we will have about 35 minutes or so of Q&A, including audience Q&A. And if anyone wants to add a question, please just put it in the Q&A box at the bottom of the screen. Ken?
Cool. All right. Yes. Thank you. Thank you, Shirin. Thank you, JD. So I am not an expert in large language models or deep learning, but I've been in the tech industry for a while now, and I've been working on digital rights campaigns for some time now. So I've kind of I feel like I've developed a pretty good mental model of the trends that we see in this industry. And I guess the trend that I'm focused on today is just the general erosion of any expectation of personal privacy. And how is that different, right? How is this technology different than what's come before? I would say just going back, in the past 20 years, my personal experience, right? We've got the Web 2.0 era, right? Brings us social media and cloud computing and all that stuff. And that's here are some great excuses to put all of your information on other people's computers that they can analyze or will be forced to give up if somebody comes with a warrant or some intelligence agency just kind of asks nicely for it, essentially, right? So it's we at that point, you're just normalizing all right, these things aren't here anymore, they're somewhere else. We get to the smartphone era, right, which is more of that, but also your location privacy is fully out the window at that point, right? Because your real-time location is available to the cell phone network, which is again available to anybody with a warrant. And additionally, as the various mechanics around third-party apps and location data happen, all of that stuff can also be purchased from data brokers, right? So it's that continues the trend, and it's a bit more and a bit more and a bit more. And now we have it's just more data collected in more places, right? And so I feel the AI era, which we are entering now, is the ultimate the culmination of all of the data from all of the things all of the time, and it's as JD was saying, essentially these models, it's they begin with scooping up the whole public internet, right? And then you mix in everything that you can legally, in theory, from your user data. And then like you get like your stew of like how all of this, like this comes back and like it connects to things and like how you, and you can generate like surprisingly like useful responses to queries out of that information. But doing all of that, making that great big stew takes like a lot of capital and a lot of resources, right? And that is kind of only available to like these couple like big tech companies that exist like right now, like the players from like the past couple eras largely, and like those and the players that like those have invested in. And then also like large like governments are basically who can do that. I know there are some like projects for building open source models and things like that, but it does seem that everybody like your open AIs and your Googles are like racing ahead of those. So yeah, I don't know. So I mean, to me at that point, it's like what we have is like this trade-off, right? It's like, are these tools that these companies are going to build worth them just like increasingly surveilling us in like unaccountable ways forever, I guess? And I've been playing with some of these tools, like I've been using GitHub Copilot and stuff. It's all right. It saves me probably, like 2% of my my work effort, right? But I do not know if that's worth living in a surveillance state. I would say, like for me, probably not. Maybe everybody else's trade-off is different. I watched the Microsoft like future of work product pitch, which was pretty good. They have some cool features, like they want to make it so like like every like meeting you do, like the entire thing is like logged, like everything everybody says, everything everybody types. And it's just sort of sitting there forever. So you can kind of always go back to it and do like a historical sentiment analysis, but also you have like a real-time sentiment analysis of how everybody's like reacting to what you're talking at that time. So, I mean, I guess that's easier than like connecting with somebody on a human level or like trying to like read emotion from people that you're like in a room or even talking to. But yeah, I don't know. It seems, again, to me, it seems not worth it. Maybe to somebody else it is. So I don't know. That's sort of where I'm left with all this stuff, where it's like I do see that there is potential utility in many of these advancements. I don't think it's as great as like the companies selling it say it is. But yeah, and I also like don't know if it's worth the cost.
Thanks, Ken. And on that note, we have a bunch of really excellent questions from our audience. And I think I would perhaps start with, oh my goodness, there's so many. One audience member asks, I am especially concerned with the issues of lack of provenance, citation of sources, and ephemerality, lack of reproducibility, and ability to reliably reference responses from ChatGPT and similar systems. And they'd appreciate it if presenters could address those issues, please. And if you could kind of explain a bit more what this person is asking about in your answer. And maybe we would start with JD if you'd be willing to take that one on.
Yeah, totally. Questions of provenance and ephemerality. I mean, I think maybe I shouldn't say this is being recorded, but if you look at the history of how these systems first arose, it's essentially a bunch of academics who are like playing around with language models and like taking all the text they could get their hands on, putting into increasingly larger models and seeing what happens. And then at some point they crossed this chasm of like, oh, wow, this is amazing. And then everyone else took notice and started being interested. And all these like companies came in and commercializing and et cetera. That's where we are now, right? If you look at the history of like open AI, right? They were like, oh, no, this should all happen in the open. And they were like, oh, well, wait, this is $1 trillion opportunity. So sorry. That's perhaps uncharitable. I think their official claim, which is probably true, is that the actual amount of resources it will take to develop this kind of thing exceeds what a nonprofit can do. And I think that's what a lot of the conversation in academia is also. But so all that is to say is if you look at that history, right, like data provenance and ephemerality are like not at all in the like piece of, are not considered in any of that history. And so there's not really scaffolding for making that happen, right? Like it's about language and the data is data that's about language, but it's also about culture and content, but that's not where it comes from. And so the concerns of provenance and ephemerality and like reproducibility and all this stuff are like really kind of coming later, because suddenly these systems are being used in a context that is not where they were originally designed by people who are not necessarily who for whom like the ephemerality and the provenance information and the content is not primary, but rather the sort of interrelationships between words is primary. So I don't know that I don't know that I have a great answer for you. I will say that a lot of these questions, we get a lot of questions about like, why does it do thing X? And I should have mentioned this in my intro, but large language models and the generative AI stuff is at the moment very much an empirical discipline. It's not really an engineering discipline per se. And the difference between that is in an engineering discipline, you would say, I made this and I understand why and how it works. And in an empirical discipline, you're almost seeing something that you've like discovered and trying to understand where and how it works. And I think because it's like a computer system and you've got all of these like, like someone wrote the code, like how can they not understand how it works? Like there is a shocking amount of we don't understand how it works going on in these systems, like more so than I think anything in computer science has ever experienced. Like we just don't. There's a lot going on here. There's a lot we don't know about how they work. We just kind of know that they do in this like weird way, and we're a lot of computer scientists are very excited about that, and like are sort of treating this as like a discovery rather than a like system building exercise. Hence the like sort of empirical nature of the work that goes around this. Like there are a ton of papers, but before GPT-3 came out, there was this other language model that was much smaller than GPT-3, but large at the time, called BERT. And it spawned this entire field of BERTology of like, how does the system work? What is it doing? Why is it doing what it's doing? At some point, I read like a summary of BERTology paper that had like 70 different papers that it was citing that had like all come out in the year since BERT had appeared. And so I think there's a lot of interest in computer scientists around like understanding this and trying to do better around provenance and trying to do better around reproducibility. And the truth is that these systems behave in extremely random ways. They are made up of giant collections of what are essentially like randomly operating subcomponents, for lack of a better word. So I mean, I think everyone would agree that it's important, and we just like the community has not yet figured out exactly why these systems lack that. And it's not obvious how to put it back in, but a lot of people are very interested in working really hard to figure that out. But it's a little bit like, for lack of a better metaphor, it's a little bit like finding a fish and being like, well, why doesn't it have legs? And it's like, I don't really know. Or maybe the legs weren't useful in the like evolutionary environment in which it created, right? Like, that's not a very satisfying answer. Like, you might care about legs a lot, and understandably, like, be like, well, this is not going to work on land, it doesn't have legs, right? And so there's a lot of like, kind of thinking going on. Anyway, I hope that is helpful in shedding some light on this question and why there isn't a better answer for it, frankly.
Really, really appreciate that. And we have a lot of questions coming in. We're going to do our best to get through all of them. And if we don't get to yours, I very much apologize. But as I said, we will do our best to get to all of them. And in that interest, or to that point, I'm going to combine two questions for Shirin, and then Ken, also curious your take. The questions are, how do you see developments in image, text to image, or image, text to video, generative AI impacting human rights evidence and documentation? And how badly how much are you concerned about deepfakes and the potential for deepfakes to sort of turbocharge misinformation and disinformation?
Yeah, thanks for that question. How much we're concerned? I think we are very concerned at Witness. We are like a major part of our work focus on that. And the reason is like for sure what we can tell is that it's going to progress. It's progressing more and more into generative, like that question said, text to image, text to video. And we see more and more progression in like how great text to video going to look like. There's a teaser this week from Runway on Gen 2, already looks pretty cool for the 3 seconds they're generating, but that's how it started also with the images. And it's really fast. So yeah, like I said it when I in the introduction, the scale and volume of creating those elements and not being able to separate them from real evidence will be really concerning. And also we see already, like, it's not it's not related to the generative AI, but we see people in power challenging and undermine truth by saying this is false. So it'll be very hard to prove evidence and use evidence, and we need to, again, use the right, create norms and ethics and disclosure around that so we can actually use that. And for the second one, the link that I put is around deepfake. That was our main project around that. And it's from the same point of view. When you can put anyone to do a say or create any event that they didn't say or did, that's a concerning aspect. And their lack of detection, again, around that is very, very concerning. And we are working with us to connect journalists and local fact checkers to media forensic experts in deepfake in order to mitigate crisis in real time. Because the problem is, like, yeah, we have a robust media landscape in US or in Europe, but there are a lot of other countries that don't have the support of media landscape that can debunk in real time and really help mitigate crisis. And when we don't do that, there is a real effect on human life. So yeah, hope that's helping.
And yeah, for my part, I would say it's gonna get weird. It's gonna get weirder. Like the what I was video especially, right? Like when we were doing like antitrust summer this past summer, like trying to get Chuck Schumer to do like a vote on some antitrust bills. I was thinking, like, so if we could do a convincing deepfake of him just announcing the vote, like, and put that on Twitter, would there be a vote? Maybe. I don't know. Like, so there'll be like this period, but like we're already in such a like low trust like environment. It's like, to a certain extent, it almost doesn't matter, because it's like there's like a whole religion built around like people thinking a guy is JFK Jr. who doesn't look like JFK Jr. You know, like things are already pretty weird. Like deepfakes will add to that, but I don't know if it'll like be like drastically different than where we already are with like our lack of trust.
Good answers all. I just want to, because we're getting some really great questions that are really digging in on the artist rights and copyright aspect. I am very eager to do perhaps our next salon on this topic with panelists who are focused in specifically on these issues. And so I think we'll mostly be getting to those in a future episode. But right now, I want to ask, and I think this is a really interesting question, because I was just reading about how the Maori people were using models similar to this to digitize 20 years of radio recordings and use it to reclaim and own models of their language, which is incredible. But this audience member is asking, I'm wondering what the huge dominance of English language content on the internet in comparison to other languages might mean for the human rights implications of large language models. Is this one case where not having too much content in, for example, minority languages might actually have a positive impact? Or are there other implications that panelists foresee? And maybe Shirin, if you could start.
Yeah, I can try. I think, like, I tried a few languages with the DALL-E text to image, and it's very interesting to see that when you try different languages, you get some kind of a different style. So there is some kind of a bias on that culture that is being implemented to the result of those images, and the results are not great. So as you have less and less data to train on languages that are like more and more marginalized, you are less likely to use those tools. If that's good or not, I don't know. It depends on how the entire world gonna act. And then if you're out of the game, you're out of the game in some ways. And we saw that with the Google Translate in the early days, also a little bit today. You can translate really well from English to maybe Spanish, but not so well from English to Arabic, right? So it's like, it's still a problem with accessibility tools that are really important. So I wouldn't say it's positive. There is also like a lot of journalists that works with language models that cannot use them in their own languages. So again, you're left out, and because the majority is happening in US and Europe from the development side, and less from other countries, so it's not really a priority, and there's no incentives to invest in that.
Would anyone else like to chime in on the subject?
I mean, I think that sounds about right to me. I will say that so-called low resource languages have been a topic of study in NLP, which is where these models came out of for a while. There was a lot of excitement within that community because there are a lot of language, and what that really means is there's not a lot of training data available. So there's not a lot of existing digitized text compared to English and other languages that sort of predominate on the internet. And one of the unfortunate facts of language on the internet that's accessible is that there are a few languages out there where a lot of the content on the internet is essentially like hate speech. And so you end up in this situation where you like ask a large language model to translate from like English into like Amharic, and it's like you get a whole bunch of like garbage hate speech out. It's like, that's not fantastic in the slightest, right? And it's not clear, more data obviously would help, but I think like cleaning up that data and finding the resources to help with that has been a challenge for years, and I think continues to be.
I'm just going to add, it's hate speech and religious text. So it's like there you have
Exactly.
two edges which are not really representative, or you want to be represented by. Yeah.
I'm going to pick up on something that Ken said, that the times are going to get weird. And we have a question from the audience about a Google engineer named Blake Lemoine, who semi-famously last year, when working with one of Google's internal large language models, announced or decided that it was sentient, and then went public with his claim that, this large language model had achieved consciousness. And the question is, do any of the panelists want to comment on this? But I'm going to add a small twist to that. There's been a fascinating spate of articles recently about the ways in which these models serve as companions. The idea that they can serve as tutors, the idea that they can help alleviate loneliness amongst the elderly, and a number of articles about people who've developed relationships with chatbots. And I think it's easy to dismiss all this as sort of beyond whatever our window is of what is normal or what deserves to be focused on in a serious conversation. But I think that this question of how we relate to large language models as, for lack of a better term, companions is going to become increasingly pressing, whether they are sentient or not. And I realize it's incredibly broad, but would love to hear the panelists' thoughts on what role do you guys see large language models playing as companions? What are some of the issues that this raises? And are you concerned about artificial general intelligence and sentience? Why don't we do Ken, then Shirin, then JD, if you guys want to.
Yeah, so I'm a big singularity guy. Not really, just kidding. I'm not concerned about artificial general intelligence. Like, I basically think what we have right now is a really awesome autocomplete. I don't know, but I think as humans, right, like just like have this natural desire to anthropomorphize things, and a language model that is talking back to you is the most natural thing to regard as another person, right? It's I don't know. When I've had cats, I've anthropomorphized them. Certainly if my cat's if a thing is texting you, then it seems reasonable to develop some sort of relationship with that thing. I don't know. I think it's hard just based on the way that humans have evolved and the way that we interact with each other as a species to be communicating with something or just be like typing something and it's like replying to you and like it seems like a conversation, but then to like take away like, nope, I know how this works intellectually, and this is like just like a computer program trying to like give me the best response. So like I don't know. And then like, am I concerned? Like, I mean, going back to the like very first like chatbots, like ELIZA bot and stuff, like people develop relationships, you know, like people are looking for relationships. That's like just like people need more relationships. People need more friends. So like that to me is like the underlying like social like issue there. And then like as with everything, there will be like the technological like band-aid of like just, you know, all right, just let him talk to a bot for whatever. Like your grandfather is getting old, you don't want to hang out with him, just let him talk to a bot. Like yeah, that's that's kind of where I see this going.
I'll try to add a little bit. I think there is always the fear from technology, right? So there, from one end, we always, from new technology, we are afraid it will like, I don't know, will overtake whatever we have right now. And it was a lot of discussion in when VR tried to be the hype or going to be, I don't know, that we're going to lose any contact for reality. There is always this type of like concern. But I think like going back, and I wonder, I'm not a specialist in that subject, but going back to how JD gave the background, and there is like this feedback improvement mechanism. So something about that feedback, we like the way we interact with those systems, gonna create a system that's gonna receive the feedback from us when we like the response, when it makes us feel good, when it's like make us feel close. So it could be also kind of like what we see on social media, the looking for our emotions and like tapping into the emotion in order to keep us engaged. So there could be those kind of systems that evolve in order to build a relationship. And yeah, I think Ken, you're right. We all want more like feel belong. So if those systems gonna make us feel belong, we probably gonna enjoy it. But I don't know if it's gonna replace real hug.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know that I have much more to add than that. I will say this sort of question of sentience and consciousness, et cetera, like super depends on what your definition of sentience and consciousness is, et cetera. And like philosophers have been arguing about that for as long as there have been philosophers. If you are familiar with like the Chinese room experiment, you know, this question of like, if you had a box that could respond in exactly the same way that a human responds to any input, but it's really just a box with a bunch of gears in it, like, does it have sentience? Which I think is kind of a little bit what we're observing here, right? We have a computer with a bunch of bits in it and it's responding in ways that people would respond. Like, what does that mean? And there's not really a super compelling answer to it. But I think the more interesting question is like, yeah, how do people feel about these things? Like, do they think that they're sentient? Because I think that plays a big role in what that actually means, right? Do they feel like they're sentient? Do they relate to them as though they are sentient? Do they relate to them as though they, when it expresses a feeling of pain, do you feel empathy for it? And I think a lot of that will have to do with context and the way that, like the context in which you are relating with these bots. Like right now, it's just a whole bunch of chat bots everywhere because that's an easy interface. But as these technologies start to get integrated in other places, right? Like, yeah, well, I think we'll see a shift there.
Moving right along, so we have many excellent questions. And maybe JD, you could start on this one. How long do you think it may take before running the existing generative AI models? We have client side, so people running them themselves as opposed to throwing whatever they want at Microsoft or Google. Could become viable for the average person, and would that help with all the privacy concerns that we've been talking about? And maybe you should also talk to the privacy concerns.
I can definitely address the technical question. I mean, I think less than you think, but I will say, I mean, like I have a nice beefy computer on my desktop. Here's a commodity hardware from Apple, right? And like last weekend, I actually got one of these running on it. I mean, it's not exactly the same, but it is, a large language model that looks a lot like what GPT-3 looked like initially when it first came out 2 years ago. And I think that, commodity hardware is about 2 years behind what is possible with these like really large systems. And then I would give it another 2 years before you start seeing the like, oh, and it runs on your phone kind of level of capability. There will always, I think, for a while still be this gap between what the like largest systems, the most capable systems, the one that have been trained on the most data, run by the giant corporations that can spend hundreds of millions of dollars on hardware, and what is like accessible to the average user. But I think that the continuing pace of how things are shifting really means that it's like a couple years difference. I'll have
JD,
thoughts on privacy too, but Ken, I would love to hear your thoughts on
no,
this.
well, I would actually, because yeah, you know a lot more about how this stuff works. So like but like doing that, right? Like I'm still like, if I download that leaked like Facebook model, right, and run it on my computer, like that is like, that's a model that Facebook spent all that money to train, right? So the data, the initial training data is like, was their resources like chosen in the way that like they, like chose that data or whatever, right? So like Facebook has defined what a dog is essentially, and now I'm running with that definition. Is that correct?
I would say yes and no. Facebook has defined what a dog is, but that doesn't mean you don't get to say, right? Like,
Okay.
You can in fact then, and I think this is again 2 years later that you can start doing this on commodity hardware, but you are probably not going to train the model from scratch, nor would you necessarily need to, because you would probably end up using a lot of the same data anyway, but you can fine tune the model locally. You can essentially say, here is data that I want you to actually think of this stuff as more relevant. And it becomes more of a challenge of like actually getting access to that data set to make the changes to the models,
Gotcha.
rather than the compute itself, which is also a challenge, but is coming. Yeah.
Great, thank you guys. And let's see here, just scrolling through the audience questions very quickly.
Well, I guess we didn't actually get to the privacy piece of that. Maybe I'll just say 2 words about that. I think that it depends on the level of your concern for having the data sort of stored and scraped by other folks. I mean, it will definitely mean that you can now run these models with your own information, like maybe, obviously there's the corporate IP kind of concerns, and then there's the like human rights activists, I don't want my information to be released. It's sensitive concerns. I think that could totally address both of those, but it depends on ultimately the use case and whether or not these models need to interact with other things in order to get you the results that you want. So models that you can run yourself, obviously, you will eliminate the need to send that data off, but they may be less capable.
And another audience question. As always, it's easy to imagine that children will be the most vulnerable to the risks of this technology, and perhaps the ones who try it first. Do you have any reflections about, from a children's rights perspective, on this development? And just to add, sort of curious the ways in which you think that these technologies will impact children potentially differently than adults. And why don't we do Shirin, then Ken, then JD, to the extent that anyone wants to answer.
I think any marginalized community, which children consider to be one of those, like are going to be affected in some ways more than others, mostly because they are not in the table, right? We're not bringing children voices a lot to test users. When we are having those panels, we don't see a lot of children like participating. So we are not hearing those voices. I will say also elderly currently, maybe it will change as elderly, we will become more and more older as generation goes, but their elderly are so much more vulnerable to scams, which is like audio manipulation, audio deepfake, and that's a huge problem too. But yeah, I have a colleague of mine that like her 10 years old daughter don't believe anything she sees. So there, and it's a huge conversation in the home, and it's the psychology effect of it. It's it's hard to say now. We need to keep monitoring it, but we need to have those voices in to understand what the vocabulary we need to use, what we need to change, and not just to put safeguard, but what exactly is the effect of it in order to create the right safeguard.
And Ken, if you also want to talk about children and seniors. That'd be great.
Sure. So as a parent of two small children, I feel like a large part of the parental experience these days is just like fighting the algorithms. Like right now, it's like my number one algorithm battle is with YouTube, right? Like, and the suggesting, like, because there's like some really great stuff on YouTube that like my son wants to watch all the prehistoric animal videos, but like, and then there's the like the weird shiny videos that are like nothing but sounds that like I don't think are good to watch, you know. So it's like part of like yeah, it's just like in your toolbox to like always be, you know, and part of this is just like be like what parents have always done, which is just like be aware of like what your kids are doing and talk to them about it. And then as far as like actually like engaging with like the generative AI tools themselves, right? Like I don't know. I mean, it's sort of like, so I mean, I would hate to think that instead of going to like art class, like my daughter would want to just like create the thing with like, you know, by typing into a prompt. But like, I also don't think she would, because it's like it's not the same experience. Like typing the thing into a prompt is more or less what she gets out of like since she's been a baby, she's basically been like, Daddy, show me a picture of this, right? Because I can more or less, right? Just from like real things that exist in the world. Like that's what image search has given us. So it's like the kids, I feel like with a lot of this stuff, almost expect it to exist already. So yeah, I don't know. Like I always like view the child's rights stuff. It's like, you know, like kids definitely should have like an expectation of privacy, and they should have an expectation of like, you know, not being advertised to in like a negative way, or like not being led down like the wrong path by these algorithms. But then so should everybody else. So I just see it as an extension of like digital rights for everybody.
Yeah, I think I agree with both of those. I mean, as I have a small child, and I am also her prompt or her text to image algorithm, and text to video as well, with slightly more constraints. I will also say though, I have a parent who has like gone and you know, this is at the moment very little to do with LLMs, but it's like on hardcore sort of conspiracy theory towards the dark side. And like, I will say that having observed that, I think the ability for sort of bad actors to cause that kind of like, I want to call it capture, for lack of a better word, is something that super concerns me, because I can see it becoming super plausible. I can see like, you know, scams and other forms of exploitation. You know, we're already seeing those. It's already becoming really easy. And I think to the extent that it's hard to discern what's real and fake, even in the best of times, an explosion of things that are fake generated by systems that are trained to produce things that appear real is going to have like a very like, I don't have an answer to that. I mean, I have like friends of mine who are teachers are all like, I don't know how to grade my students' essays anymore. Like, do I just have them write the essay with ChatGPT and then like I make my assignments about something else? And I evaluate like how effectively they can do critical thinking with ChatGPT rather than just sort of independently. And I think, you know, how do I like steal a bunch of money from people with ChatGPT is like a different question than like, how do I steal a bunch of money from people with spam emails? I feel like that's underexplored, but it's coming. You know, it's not, the genie's out of the bottle there.
Yeah, I mean, like the scams on like older folks, like just like over the phone, have been like, yeah, I've definitely like parents
Like
and like
fakes.
in-laws, yeah, like, but the deep fakes will be like, yes, the next level of that, right? And I mean, but like that, I feel like the solution to that is like largely like trying to make it so like, so there's probably some technical fix so that like we aren't all getting phone calls trying to steal our money all day, you know? Like I feel like there is a tech fix in there somewhere.
And I think the detection piece of it may be more challenging. Like, I think we need to take more of a precautionary approach, right? Like, if you are not 100% sure, if you are not authenticated to the person that you're talking to, you should assume it's not, right? And I think that's frankly going to be the only way, because these systems are just going to get too good at generating fake stuff that if you don't know, is back to the provenance question with a different take. Like, if you don't know what that channel is to in some way that you can trust, you shouldn't trust it. Sorry, that was dark, but
but real.
Yeah, but very real. We are coming up on time. So just very quickly to close us out, I'm hoping to do a lightning round of a watch this space for lay people. What are you paying attention to in this space? What are you finding really interesting? Where can people go for additional resources? What's your top plug for the average human rights activist to stay up on what's happening with the generative AI? And we'll go, let's see, in order of the screen, JD, Ken, and Shirin.
Oh man, yeah. I mean, I can tell you what I'm watching is I'm watching this sort of like truth fiction kind of divide. In other words, like, can we get these systems to more concretely point to information themselves that they're drawing on? I think we're seeing some work in that direction. I'm looking to the sort of explosion of possibility that like just appeared in December, and I'm looking to see like who is using that and in what ways, because I think that will be telling on whether or not we'll end up with like positive use and protective use, as well as sort of negative and maladaptive use. I think those are kind of the two main things that I'm looking at.
Ken, you got any plugs, links, accounts, thinkers?
So as far as places to watch, like, I guess like just in terms of like what I'm looking at and what I think like is interesting to me to see is like what, like, you know, as like ChatGPT has like become like an AP, like clearly they want to be like the platform for this thing. Like I want to see what happens downstream of that, like if people are building more useful things and like thinking about things in a way that you know, like it's just because so far I just feel like the applications have been so broad, and I would be very interested to see like kind of more like neatly packaged applications of this technology and just kind of see what people actually do with it. Which isn't really much human rights thing; it's more just like, I guess, more tech industry thing. But yeah, I am very interested to see what happens there.
I think similar from my end, like it's everything happening so fast in the last couple of weeks, months, and so it's really interesting to see how people are using it and where is it going. But I kind of like JD referred to it. What is the good use of it? How we can use that for good? Even all the alarms going on, like climate change, generative AI, everything gonna take our jobs and we're gonna die. How we can silence those alarms and kind of like see how we are using that for the good and to protect us and to, so yeah, I'm looking at those types of channels.
We are at time, and just a tremendous thank you to our panelists, Shirin, JD, and Ken. This was amazing and just deeply appreciated. And thank you to all of our audience members for all the amazing questions. And as always, a tremendous thank you to Leah and Essie for doing all of the heavy lifting and bringing this together.
Yeah,
Thanks.
thank you, Michael. Thank you so much. If you would like to watch or share this video, it will be going up at generativeaiforactivists.com. And we are also in the process of getting a podcast feed going to make these easier for everybody to listen to and share. So go there, subscribe for updates on what our next sessions will be about. There is a lot of topics to cover, as is evidenced by how many questions we didn't get to. So thank you all so much, and we'll see you soon.